Just a couple of comments there. I'm remembering from a sequence in the Human Quest, which of course I won't try and show you, that I actually did a thing called the Turing Test that Christoph mentioned, which is you're put behind a screen and at the other side is either a human being or a computer. All you get is typescript coming out at you. And you have to figure out whether you're talking to a human being or a computer. And I remember very clearly that I got right all of the computers. I figured them all out, but I actually assigned 2 human beings to being computers. So it's actually kind of difficult to do. You were talking, Christoph, let me just start with this, and Michael, you'll have a comment on it as well. You were talking earlier about being in the flow of things. You were talking about the Eugen Herrigel quote and so on. Have either of you read Malcolm Gladwell's new book, Blink? All right, so a lot of you would know about this notion of fast cognition and thin slicing and so on. It seems to me a little bit of a not entirely correct. There are some, the idea is that your intuition, your fast cognition works so rapidly, and in the case of identifying whether the Kouros was a mistake or not and so on, some of you know this story. But on the other hand, you plainly need experience, an experienced database to be able to make some of the more complicated decisions. How do you strike that balance? So can you talk about that? Because this actually all 3 of you, because you're talking about a child's experience to novelty when it doesn't have a huge database, it doesn't have a massive representations that it has to wrestle with. But later in life, it has all this vast stock.
When you're in the flow, your mind is left free to ponder long-term things, to ponder more long-term issues. So when you're giving a talk, I'm very aware of this, every time you give a talk, or when you're just having an intense conversation with somebody, it's not that you're thinking, okay, this is the next sentence I'm going to say, and I'm going to say it to myself in German because I'm German, and then I'm going to, this is a verb, and well, this is the beginning, and then 200 words later it's a verb, and then I'm going to send it to my English translator, and then next thing I send it off to my Larynx. It's nothing like it, right? I have a very vague idea what I'm going to say now to you in the next 5 seconds. The next thing I hear these words come tumbling out of my mouth. So that's... No, so I mean, that's one of these examples, because I've given you hundreds of talks on this topic. It's zombie system, but my mind in the meantime is left free sort of to ponder, oh, there was this other point that Roger made, and that I have to still answer. So it's not that I'm unconscious, but I'm by and large totally unconscious of the things I'm actually doing right there at the moment.
Well, this comes up again in an interesting way if you're thinking about the children in our experiments, because of course exactly what they're not doing is they're not sitting there and saying, oh, well, that one was statistically independent of this other one, so it must be that it's that causal structure rather than another. There's a lovely quote from actually the philosopher Jerry Fodor when someone asked what the stream of consciousness was when he was doing his work, and he said, mostly it's, you can do it, Jerry. Come on, Jerry. Go at it, Jerry. And I actually think that may be very true as far as the children are concerned. I think most of the stream of consciousness that's going on with them is, oh, tough, hard, and then, aha, got it. And you can watch that happening on their faces. So I think what may happen is there's a funny balance between the stream of the things that we're actually conscious about are more of these sort of points of, am I going in the right direction? Is this going to yield results? This is actually the right kind of match, rather than having what we think of as, say, a scientific stream of consciousness where we think there's a whole bunch of sentences that we're working out. And I think it would be quite interesting to try and work that out more.
Michael?
I'm fond of saying that science doesn't come naturally in the sense of control group, experimental group.
Right.
Anecdotal thinking comes naturally, connecting A to B. We're pattern-seeking primates and all that stuff. So, Aunt Mary's cancer went away after she had extractive seaweed. I better try it too. That seems like a natural way that we evolved to connect A to B. And often at times A was connected to B really, so we survived. How do you train adults to be like kids in causal inference for things like A is not connected to B? Right. Superstitious thinking.
What about, just one other point, when you were talking about the children have this very supportive environment, a lot of parental investment, they're just sitting there learning causality, learning the world so that they can then navigate through biological marketplaces and so on and so forth. It almost seemed as though you were making a claim that was a kind of a definition of intelligence. And one wonders, you know, you can obviously take a child who's being at a magnet school, being totally supported and so on, but you can also imagine a kid who's having to navigate through in a really tough biological marketplace, say the streets of Delhi or something. This is a sort of artful dodger hypothesis, which has got a very fast, very, very good cognition, but has none of the normal support. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
So it's a very highly individualized,
Right.
what I'm saying.
So Michael's question is what I think of as the if babies are so stupid, how come we're so if babies are so smart, how come we're so stupid question, right? Which is a question that always comes up. Yeah. One reason is because we're stupider. I mean, so if you look at it from a neurological perspective, I think we just are stupider than children are. But I think a more sort of optimistic point is if you think about the kinds of problems those children are solving, if we did that problem as a paper and pencil problem, or we simply told them about it, we wouldn't get those results. We've tried it. Even if we do it on a computer screen, the way I did it with you, we don't get those results. So we get it if it's a real problem, the children can do real interventions. It's easy for them to do interventions. When they have a hypothesis, they can test it a second afterwards. That's the circumstance in which we see this incredible causal inference. And of course, the problem is that for lots of things that are really important to us, like medicine, like whether we're going to get sick or not, a lot of the things that we do in science, none of those things are true. We can't just give grandma the extractive seaweed 3 seconds later and see whether she gets better or not. And my guess is if you actually could have the circumstance where you could actually do the right interventions and experiments right on the spot, easily, without a big investment of time and energy, and you got the right pattern of results, then I think people would not make these kinds of mistakes. So I think the thing is that children are not consciously knowing. There's a difference between sitting there. The problem for us scientists is we have to design the right experiments consciously and decide what the consequences of them are. The children are just getting bombarded with information all the time, and just their restlessness and their getting into everythingness and their lack of a frontal lobe means that for the problems that they're trying to solve, they're just getting evidence constantly. And I think that's the things where we see the most superstition and the most irrationality in adults, which are exactly things like medicine, are cases where it's very important and we don't have very much evidence and we don't have simple ways of getting a lot of evidence. There's a question here, in fact, when you're talking about experiments, what kind of activities would you suggest to encourage the scientific, in quotes, type behavior in an everyday life of an 18-month-old? Again, before you answer that, there is a nice sequence in Human Quest of Alison explaining, we're watching a child that is constantly dropping a spoon. Remember this? Dropping a spoon. It's about 12 months old, maybe. That was an experiment that you described as the child seeing what the result would be in the environment. And the environment was, of course, the poor old mother had to pick the thing up every time and give it back to her. So it was training the mother was the experiment. So what kind of activities would you suggest to encourage? And there's two questions like that, in fact. What kind of toys could people buy for their... Well, this actually gets back to your question, Roger, which is one of the things that's so striking about this is that the children are incredibly good at figuring out what the activities are that are going to teach them the most. And my rule of thumb is if they're giggling, that means that they're learning. And especially if they're giggling and you're giggling, that definitely means that they're learning. And they're very good at figuring out which things are going to be relevant to their particular problems. And what that means is that a lot of the things that people think are learning activities for adults, because adults are so slow relatively, like, reading and writing and doing math and all that, those aren't the things that are learning activities for children. The things that children are doing spontaneously anyway, at least children under 5, playing, all the things that are the, great old classic toys, putting rings on a stick, playing with refrigerator boxes, getting into mixing bowls, those are the things that are actually teaching children. So the thing to do is to find out what the kids want to do when you're talking about 18-month-olds, what they want to play with, and let them play with it. That's the secret. Not go out and buy the $100 electronic learning toy. And also to be sort of around so that if the children are quite good at giving adults around them signals about what extra information, what they want to do next, what they want to find out about next. Which I also wanted to say something about your example of Delhi. It's interesting that if you look across cultures, It is true that by the time you've got 7 or 8 or 9-year-olds, they're actually already starting to be productive members of the society. But if you look across cultures from 0 to 5, and in most cultures there's a fairly clear break, there's a thing that happens around 5 or 6, which says you're not a baby anymore. The babies, the ones who are 0 to 5, are being put in this protected, sheltered environment. It isn't always the mom who's doing it. It could be a grandmother, it could be an older sib, but they are in this protected, sheltered environment. And I think there's a lot of evidence that if they aren't, if they're under various kinds of stress, their learning really suffers. Even their brain development suffers. So I do think that when you're talking at least about 0 to 5-year-olds, that we have some empirical evidence that nurturance, that love, that protection, that sense of not being under stress to actually be out there in the biological marketplace is really important to have this kind of relaxed learning. Which is not to say that there aren't things that you learn later on in the stress of the marketplace, but I think that protected period is actually very important.
So one for you, Christoph. Do animals have consciousness? And by implication, do they any, I think this one asks also, do they have any rights, and how do you protect those animals during experiments?
Yeah, the working hypothesis is for most of us that at least some animals have consciousness, where they lack the most distinguished difference between us. A, they don't talk, by and large, and B, they don't have, even higher primates don't have nearly as much self-consciousness as we do. So they don't know about death, they don't know about Macintosh or about, about the vote. But certainly mammals have sensations. It's, like I say, it's more difficult right now because we don't have any absolute test yet. It's more difficult to define where does it end, where does it begin, at what species level. Ultimately, of course, this will have consequences for animal rights, because if animals are conscious versus a creature that's just all reflex, that's just a non-sentient, a non-feeling machine, as it were, I guess one could accord less rights to a creature such as yourself. And then it's a question of trade-off. Are you willing to help cure AIDS? Are you willing to prevent, SIDS or schizophrenia? And if that requires, are you willing to make the trade-off that versus doing animal experiments? That's a debate society at large then has to go through. But the assumption is that at least mammals share most of consciousness with us.
Could you do a little follow-up there as well on the what appeared to be the democratic presidential neuron that you identify? What does that lead you to in terms of thinking about the structure of the brain, the structure of neural networks, and so on and so forth? I mean, where do you think the information is stored?
Well, I mean, it has to do with the question that Hume has asked 300 years ago: how do you represent information in your brain? So there are two extreme ways to do it. One is if you think about anything like, George W., or you think the idea of justice, or you think of the idea of, of LA as a mecca of the entertainment industry. Any of these ideas could be implemented by a network that has, let's say, 10 million members, and the exact pattern, if you think of justice, the Platonic idea of justice, is one particular set of neurons, of these 10 million neurons firing. And if you think about, Abu Ghraib scandal, then it's a different set of neurons or it's the same set of neurons that fires in slightly different ways. So in other words, in order to understand anything in the brain, you have these very large collection of neurons. However, the other extreme that some people have advocated is that for things that you're very familiar with, for things that you think all the time, your loved ones, your family, people you see on TV, famous politicians, things that if you're a lawyer, you will hopefully think about justice all the time, that they're a discrete set of neurons that only fire to those. So it's a much more discrete, it's called a grandmother representation. The idea being, if you're raised by your grandmother, there are a set of neurons that fire to your grandmother, and there's another set of neurons that fire to your grandfather, etc. And here we seem to have discovered such a representation, and it has important implications for how any information ultimately is represented in the brain, and how you can influence it. For example, if you think about, doing a prosthetic device, going inside the brain and, putting electrodes to change perception, is that possible, and how is that possible?
But if your Clinton neuron died, would Clinton disappear from your brain?
What maybe, it's a good question. People always laugh and say, well, that's ridiculous. It may well be. And so by and large, if one Clinton neuron dies, you probably don't have an effect. However, it may well be that if one neuron dies, you may have a slight hesitation. Clinton, oh yeah, that was the president. And then if I take out 3 or 4 or 5 of these neurons, if I could find them, then you would say, oh yeah, I remember there was in the late 90s, what's his name again? There was that president, remember, was that scandal? So it's well possible that, because if you test, it's just not true. There used to be the theory that the brain is a hologram and you can cut out large chunks of it and makes no difference. That's BS. If you look at any brain in an adult has a specific function, if you take out that brain, you may see, if you test it carefully enough, a specific loss of function.
Although it is interesting that, you mentioned that it's an adult brain. It is interesting that exactly a contrast that you see is that if you take a child brain, then you see this enormous recovery, so that you can have big chunks of children's brains. You can have children with hydrocephaly who end up with, a half an inch of cortex left, who go to college, who develop normally. So there's something that's happening, again, between this tremendous plasticity in the child brain and then this much more specified function that you see in the adult brain.
And Michael, on the Persinger thing, question here, did you run a control? In other words, did you sit for an hour with a helmet on but no computer connection?
Yeah, that's the control.
Let's see you doing that.
I would be more impressed with Persinger if he had better controls like that, because in fact, if you do, like in the 70s, I tried the isolation tanks, but all this was part of my drug-free and legal ways of having hallucinations, because I thought I might want to use my brain again someday. Same reason I don't use performance-enhancing drugs, and therefore I'm kind of slow.
Yeah.
But yeah, sure. If you sit in an isolation tank, you have a flood of thoughts and feelings of floating, of course, because you're in a tank. But and in fact, in Persinger's lab, you're in this like big cushion chair, one of those not a Barking lounge, the things with the Homer type chair, and so it is kind of that sense of. So it's hard to say whether it's one way or the other, and more controls would be better. The other thing about Persinger is that he thinks there is such a thing as the paranormal that needs a scientific explanation. So here I disagree. I think there's nothing that needs to be explained in that sense. He thinks people can somehow maybe connect to one another telepathically, something like that, maybe, and he might be able to discern which part of the brain is doing this in a scientific way. So he's doing good science within a parameter that I think is probably not correct. And then the other thing, he thinks that because I asked him, what would trigger these things? You got these solenoids right there. Where would this happen in the real world that would cause people to have alien abductions or sense of presence or out-of-body experiences or whatever? And so he kind of has this postulation about earthquakes, thrust faults cause magnetic fields and so on. And I thought, well, yeah, we do have a lot of weird things in Southern California where there's a lot of earthquake activity. But with the dissipation of energy over the square of the distance, I mean, come on, it's a long ways to the fault line from my brain to it. What are the chances that it's pounding on it, not yours? Why did I have it? I don't think he's got the answer, but it's an interesting way to try to get to it.
He's at a very interesting place in the brain, though, because it's known that some types of people who have epileptic seizures, including if you go back in history, Jean of Arc or St. Paul, on his conversion experience on the road to Damascus, that some type of epileptic seizures associated with experiential experiences, that people have a particular type of seizure that by and large happens in the medial temporal lobe, which is where he thinks he stimulates. Sometimes these seizures can go ahead with intense religious ideation, intense feeling of presence. Sometimes if you're non-religious, it's just present. Even non-religious people have this feeling there's something there above and beyond them. If you're very religious, of course, you think it's God. And it tends to be expressed when you have this hyper-synchronized pathological activity in this particular part of the brain, for reasons we don't understand.
Yeah, the term neurotheology, which I think Rama would have spoken about had he been here, I'm not sure if you knew this, but it actually turns up in that wonderful novel by Aldous Huxley called Island, where he talks about a lot of these issues. Alison, there is a question which may have been prompted by Larry Summers, president of Harvard's latest remarks, but somebody has asked, was there a gender difference in the way the kids dealt with the gear problem, apart from the boys beating the other ones up?
Right. The answer is there isn't. And it's worth pointing out. In fact, I just was involved in a debate about this on the website, on the EDGE website. It's a real problem because for us developmental psychologists, of course, we do sort of look at gender the way we look at other things when we're doing our experiments. But of course, when we have negative findings, which is almost all of the time, that doesn't really count as a result. So for example, Simon Baron-Cohen thinks that there's these big gender differences in children's ability to understand psychology, which I mentioned before, and their ability to understand physical things like the gear toy that I showed you. We've tested hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children. We've never seen any gender differences in those, along those dimensions. Now, there may be some. I mean, certainly there's evidence that boys, for instance, tend to be physically more active on a large scale than girls at preschool. And that may make a big difference to the kinds of experiences they have and the kinds of things they learn about. But on our tasks, we see both the boys and the girls being just as curious, just as inquisitive, just as involved in figuring out what's going on. And as I say, I think overall, there's this kind of asymmetry, because when you don't find gender differences, you don't report them and they just kind of disappear, whereas when people do find them, then they get a lot more attention.
If some of these qualities that we're supposed to have, these vaunted qualities like doing statistical inferences and to figure out causality, having a cheater detection mechanism if you're an ev-psych person, why are we so bad at a lot of these things? I mean, an intuition. Why are we so bad at catching scam artists? Why are we so bad at actually inferring the statistical qualities of the environment and so on? We really don't do a very good job of this.
Well, the scam artists are kind of interesting because, of course, one of the things that you might expect is I think there's a bit of a cognitive arms race within human beings, because one of the things that we realize, of course, when we start figuring out the causal structure of the world is what it is that other people think about the causal structure of the world. And I think from very early on, all those magicians that we saw yesterday and the scam artists, just like they're using our perceptual system to get us to see things that aren't there, they're also using our causal inference system to get us to believe in causal links that aren't there. And in fact, magicians, I think most of what they do is they do one or the other. They persuade us that something's disappeared, or they persuade us that something made something else happen, that the thought in your head actually was the cause of the thought in my head. And I think people actually start exploiting our ability to make these inferences to get power and authority and all the rest. So I think, Roger, it's like the perceptual illusions. You know, every vision scientist will show you a zillion amazing perceptual illusions. They don't show that we're bad at seeing things. In fact, they show that we're really good at seeing things, but because we're designed to see things in particular kinds of environments, if you shift around the environment, we can make terrible mistakes. So again, I think if you think about a child's environment, or even maybe an environment in which we have lots of opportunities to get evidence, we have lots of opportunities to intervene, then I think our statistics is actually, our causal inference is actually very good. It's in very special environments. And interestingly enough, I think charlatans, cultists, magicians over the years have worked out exactly what those environments are and created them. We can actually create special environments in which we will make systematic kinds of mistakes in those kinds of inference. So I don't think that shows that we're not good at it. In some ways, it almost shows that we are good at it because we can create special circumstances in which we'll make very systematic mistakes, the same way that perceptual illusions actually show how good we are at seeing, not how bad we are at seeing.
On that point, Christoph, though, this is actually on the same point. Would the gorilla suit thing have worked, is the question here, in a 3D environment? In other words, if somebody was doing it on a stage.
Yes, if you give sufficient distracting, I mean, you see it every day in accidents that happen that are unexplained, when plain broad daylight, without foul play, without alcohol, people run into each other. And so now, it happens all the time. Recently there was this 2 years ago, this terrible tragedy in Taipei where an airliner landed, tried to take off from a runway, which was blocked, was clearly visible. The investigation concluded the pilot failed to see it, inattentional blind. He just didn't see what was clearly marked. Yes, so it can happen also. I want to say something to Alison, because I think you're maybe overestimating the cognitive power of children. I mean, the problem you showed us was a one-dimensional variable. The problem scientists deal with today in medicine and biology have hundreds of free variables or thousands of free variables. If you look at cancer, it's caused maybe by a combination of 30 different genes out of 30,000, we don't know which 31, combined with all sorts of environmental insult. And so you have to manipulate these incredible high-dimensional variables, which is, I submit, substantially more difficult than having a system where you have one variable and you tweak it here or here, right? So.
Well, I think part of the reason why children are so successful, another reason why they're so successful, is because what they do is break up, what evolution does in a sense for them, is break up these big problems into what start out initially as being relatively simple problems, with just, say, 3 or 4 variables, with a limited variety of causal hypotheses that you can do. And then there's this kind of bootstrapping effect where, by doing that, Now you have a new set of problems. Now you have a new set of explorations that you can do. You can take the output of those problems and make still further inferences. And again, if you want to say why are people bad at, why are adults bad, it is because we're bad at considering, say, 20 or 30 variables at once. I think we are bad at doing that. But the idea is that the basic inferential processes are not things that we're bad at, that we're fundamentally rational. And if we can make contact with these fundamentally rational pieces, where when we teach, for instance, when we can actually say to people, here's the problem and here's the answer, then I think we are much more rational. And I think even if you look at, the wild, crazy, paranormal kind of stuff, it's interesting that people feel the need to defend those claims. So, I mean, the fact that there's creation science in some ways seems to me to be terribly hopeful, because you'd think that if you were really a creationist, Thomas Aquinas, I think, said this, what do you mean I have to defend this? What do you mean I have to provide evidence for it? This is divine revelation. It's just divine revelation. And the fact that instead of just saying, you know why it is that we know that Darwin is wrong? Because God said so. That's why, right? I mean, you could say that. And in fact, that's not what people do. They make up all these elaborate stories about, oh, well, there's this evidence and there's that evidence. And it seems to me that shows that deep down inside, people really do care about evidence. The big issue is, how do you get the right evidence? How do you decide what evidence you're going to believe and what evidence you're not going to believe, and so on? One of the things that's interesting with children is up till 5, a lot of the evidence they're using is this evidence that comes from their own direct experience. When they get to be about 4 or 5, suddenly they start taking on board a whole lot of evidence from other people. They start taking what other people say to them and treating it as if that's relevant evidence too. And of course, that's an enormously good thing to do. That's part of what enables us to have culture, is that we can take information from other people and use it. But it has terrible costs as well, because if that information is wrong, then you're going to draw the wrong conclusions. So it's not irrational if someone came up to you and said, I was on a road and I was stopped and there was a bright light and I was taken up by aliens. If you think that what that person is saying is likely to be true, it's not irrational to believe that that could happen. That's a perfectly rational conclusion to draw. So there's things about, there's lots of reasons, I think, why we could have these fundamentally very accurate mechanisms that could end up in special circumstances leading us to inaccuracies.
I don't think, though, there's special circumstances. You look at the bubble. Remember the bubble? Remember the stock bubble?
Right.
Everybody managed to convince themselves it would just go up and up and up. So I think these special circumstances exist all the time, that throughout much of our lives we live in these fictitious stories that are just based on, not on any facts, but on beliefs, and not on rational beliefs either.
Well, I guess I would say we often are doing it on beliefs. I'm not sure that they're not rational beliefs, given the premises.
Within the constraints of the belief system, there's a logic within it.
Yeah.
Now, the whole system may be flawed,
Right.
but the steps within it. So my new approach with intelligent design creationists now is to say, or to anybody I'm talking to, why do you believe in God? Because it looks like it's designed. You're right, it does look like it's designed.
Right.
It was designed, but it's a bottom-up designer called natural selection that tinkers along. So it is designed. We'll give you the design argument, but who's the designer, or what's the designer?
Here's one of the old chestnuts that you've all probably had to answer before. Probably, Michael, you do it from a different perspective. How much of the brain is actually being used, if at all? No. Sorry, that was inappropriate in addition. Does the
if you
brain...
buy my book, I can tell you it's only 10%.
Does the brain have a maximum capacity for thinking and remembering? There's another thing connected to this, Christoph, while you're on it. Has anyone tested visual percepts for correlation to handedness? Obviously, some right-handed people here want to be...
Probably left-handed people.
All those questions and more will be revealed in my book. That's available for $9.99 outside. No, so if you look in an adult brain, I mean, it's very different before puberty, but after puberty, there's somewhat less plasticity. It's still plasticity, but less. Then, like I said, every time you remove a part of the brain, you can find a specific deficit. Now, sometimes it's not easy to find. So, for example, you may know about the split brain experiments that were done here at Caltech, for which Roger Sperry got the Nobel Prize. You know, where you cut the entire corpus callosum, 200 million fibers connecting the left and the right brain. It turned out that operation was first done in 1939 by surgeons to alleviate massive epileptic seizures. It was done for 15 years, and people by and large couldn't find any deficits. Now, right now, if there's a split brain patient, if you do the right thing, you can find out their profound deficits, like you're only talking to half of their brain, right? They're profound deficits that you can elicit immediately now that you know what to test for. So likewise, when people claim that you only use 10% of the brain, it's not true in the sense that if I take out any one part of your brain, there will be specific deficits that I can test. People have not found memory capacity limitation. They did these experiments, very heroic ones, by standing in University of Pennsylvania in the 50s. They gave them up where a person were supposed to recognize images, and they gave up after a few 10,000 images because people could still, with far better than chance probability, recognize images. And after a while, it just got to 10 years. So we don't really understand what are the limits on memory, and is the limits more that we tend to forget things, or that we just don't encode them properly, and there's interference with the encoding? We don't know right now.
There's a question there that asks you all to comment on what you think about the blank slate notion. Let me set that up a little bit. There's a couple of clips in there with Steve where he talks first of all about language and basically says everywhere on the planet children have language. If you take take two children, put them down in Japan, one's English, one's Japanese, they'll end up speaking Japanese. But if you do that with a gerbil and have the gerbil sitting there listening to the conversations, what will end up is that the kids will end up speaking English and Japanese, but the gerbil will not. And that's because the gerbil does not have capacities, a language instinct, as we would describe it. He then goes on to talk about the notion of the blank slate as being a totalitarian's dream, in the sense that if there is nothing built in, nothing innate, then you can go to thought training camps and you'll end up being brainwashed. I mean, these obviously extreme positions, and I think that's the problem with the whole notion, but would you like to comment on the whole notion of innate versus learned?
Well, I think it's one of these multifactorial problems we just talked about. It's not just one. I mean, it's not just genes, not just environments, it's both. There are lots and lots of examples for that. Essentially, we are given by natural selection, we're given this brain at birth called neocortex. Well, what makes us really different that we have a much more neocortex than most other mammals. And this allows us to make inferences about the world. It allows us to make prediction about the world. And that's as Alison had showed in her patients, in her children. That's what we grow up with. Now it depends on the environment we're born with. If we're deprived, if we don't get enough to eat, if we get beaten, etc., then those things don't have a chance to develop. But if we do get the proper nourishing environment, then we can develop to the fullest of our potential those things that we evolved for, which is to think and to run and to enjoy and to enjoy life. So it's always a combination of both genes and environment. It's never nurture. So I mean, Roger said that it's not really this, it's a false dichotomy to say, is it nurture or is it nature? What you can ask is what's the percentage contribution? Is it this trait more genetically inherited like IQ, or is it more environmental dependent? But even that is very dicey because many of these things like IQ or like other psychological factors are probably formed by 10s or 20s or 30s or 50s of different genes interacting in very, very complicated ways. So right now, the honest answer is we just don't know, and the answer is going to be both of the above in some complicated manner.
You know, I think it's even more of a misguided question than that. So what people often say is, well, look, it has to be some complicated combination of the two, and it has to be genes and environment interacting, all of which is true, and it's got to be some percent of one and some percent of another. But there's some distinctive things about human beings that really make that question deeply incoherent for human beings. And the thing that's so distinctive about human beings is that we create our own environments. So if you're trying to calculate, for example, how much are genes responsible for a trait and how much is an environment responsible for the trait, you have to know what people sometimes call the range of reaction of the genes. What's the range of environments in which this gene is going to be manifested? That's the only way that you can make any kind of claim about how much the gene is contributing to the trait. Now, for human beings, what happens is that we actually have this amazing capacity to create our own novel environments. That's our trick. That's what our genes enable us to do. And what that means is that we have this very peculiar situation where our genes actually enable us to, say, represent the causal structure of the environment and intervene and make that environment into a different environment than it would otherwise have been. And now our genes are living in this new environment that we actually created. And the result of that is that it's sort of impossible It's not just sort of, well, it's some percent in another. Let me give you a very simple but very dramatic example of this. You probably know there's a syndrome called phenylketonuria, which all babies, when babies get that little prick in their heels, it's to test for it. And it's a particular kind of amino acid problem, which means that the children can't actually metabolize certain proteins in food, and they suffer from terrible retardation and die. Now, of course, what we do as human beings is we test for that, and we make sure that if children have this syndrome, they don't get that particular protein in their food, and they don't get retarded anymore. So what's the relationship between the retardation and phenylketonuria? Is it environment or is it genes? What percentage is environment and what percentage is genes? Well, it's 100% genes, because if you have the gene, you'll be susceptible to the syndrome. And it's 100% environment, because if you change the environment, no one will ever suffer from phenylketonuria retardation before. And it is because we have this incredible capacity to actually say, oh, okay, we can think about phenylketonuria. If you were an animal that couldn't represent the world, there would be a direct relationship between the gene and the syndrome. But because we can create a new environment in which that gene no longer has that, leads to that trait, there's a sense in which it isn't even coherent to talk about a percentage that comes from one place and a percentage that comes from another place.
Well,
maybe,
but we should not throw out the baby with the bathwater. We should not throw out the many
which doesn't
factors.
mean that doesn't mean that there isn't anything to say about it. Of course, you can tell for any specific case, you can tell a very specific story about here's what the genes do, here's what the environment does, here's the environmental cascade that results, here's what this gene will do in this environment. But that doesn't necessarily tell you that that's what a gene will do in any environment. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, you're right. It won't tell us what it'll do in any environment because, of course, it's impossible to enumerate all possible environments. But, for example, you take a trait like aggressiveness, okay? Very strong link between testosterone levels, GY or XX or XY, male or female, and aggressiveness. Been true throughout history, been true in all culture. You can plot, for example, lifetime, excess death. John Norman has this beautiful plot in his book where you just plot the ratio of dying in any particular age cohort between males and females. And so you see between, the age of 0 and 15, it's more or less equal. Then between 15 and 35, you get 3 times more boys or men that die because of doing stupid things, right? Running, drinking and climbing and homicide, etc. Okay, now this link with aggressiveness relates also to testosterone. It seems to be true in all cultures where people have checked, and seems to be true even, as far as back we can see in history. So in that sense, that seems to be a trait that seems to be heavily co-regulated with genes. And to say, we can probably totally disconnect that or dissociate that link is probably extremely unlikely in my eyes.
Well, I don't think the point is not that genes don't contribute, but the point is that being able to say this is a percentage of which they contribute versus an environment, I think is a misguided way of thinking about it. I mean, take another gender example, just to choose one at random. For instance, suppose you thought there might be a connection between gender and mathematical and scientific ability, just to choose an example at random. Well, the truth is, in the environment in which we adapted, there was absolutely no genetic contribution to having a mathematics position at Harvard, right? There was no difference between the number of men and the number of women in the Pleistocene who had mathematics positions in the department at Harvard. Because, of course, there were no mathematics positions, and there was no Harvard to have mathematics positions at. In that environment, so that when we say, well, there's this trait doing well at mathematics, that's a trait that only makes sense in an environment in which mathematics is a possibility. On the other hand, in the environment in which my own mother grew up, there was an absolute relationship between genetics and the ability to get a mathematics degree at the University of Pennsylvania because women weren't allowed in any of the mathematics programs. So women weren't actually allowed to take the advanced mathematics courses. So there was a very straightforward relationship between her genome and her mathematics ability in that context. The trouble is that we just don't know. So both of those are cases where you say, well, but come on. I mean, that doesn't really count. The trouble is, since we don't know what the range of environments are, we don't know for these sophisticated social and cultural traits, which are the ones that really matter to us, what that means outside of a range of environments. I don't think there's anything very informative to say about what contribution there might or might not be of genes and environments in those cases.
To name another random gender example, okay, which is You name another example is color vision, okay, very well explored. So it turns out there are many of you here who are colorblind, who probably only have 2 photoreceptor pigments for cones, okay? Now, by and large, 10 to 1, those of you who have this defect are going to be men, right? We know all about the genetics associated with the sex gene. We understand the linkage. It turns out that many women, in fact, have so most of us have 3 photopigments for normal red, green, and blue. A lot of women have expressed in the retina photopigments for 4. They have the 2 different red alleles, and then they have green and blue. So those women would have super color resolution. And as I said, sort of men in poetic justice, many men only have 2. This is entirely due to genetics, okay? It's something that whether or not you express a particular gene that turns out a particular protein in our eyes. It's a complicated thing relating to aesthetic perception.
We'll have one more example.
But doesn't it follow from that if men and women both go shopping, since women see less choices, that they ought to shop more quickly than men? Can I just... There was one final question. It was a question for me, which says, is your view a refutation of evolutionary psychology, or a more simply trying to redefine words like plasticity and other amorphous words like module? No, in fact, it's a refutation. There is a lot of debate about what is exactly meant by a module, and if you read philosophers, psychologists, neuroscience, they're all different definitions, and I think it's fruitless to worry too much about that. I think what we're talking about here is very much the important organ, if you want to call it an organ here, is the plasticity of the neocortex, the fact that you can build what we call adaptive representational networks in there, which, as I said, consist essentially of a yoking together of a stimulus environment, an internal state, a state change, a behavior that you emit, and then a system which is calibrating whether what you did is making your life better or worse. And those little 4-frame movies, if you think of them, we think of them as the sort of fundamental units of intelligence, and that each of us builds up huge databases of these as we navigate through our different lives and different marketplaces, which is why the book is called The Origin of Minds, meaning that there are 6 billion of them, not just a universal human mind. So if you think of what the example Alison gave earlier of being in Paris in the spring and falling in love, that in that little 4-frame movie, there's a lot of things being pulled at one time. You've got a new stimulus environment, you've got coursing neurochemicals going on, you've got an internal state change. And I don't think there's anything in the standard EP model that can truly explain that. This is much more a prediction reward neuroscience kind of analysis that we brought together with the adaptationist perspective and blended them together. So it's very hard to teach an old dog new tricks, but you can do it if you change the environment. If you want to change your mind, change the environment. So if you want to change your mind about feeling hungry now, we should change the environment, Michael.
By setting him to lunch, yes. One housekeeping note, we'll come back we have plenty of time for lunch, so we'll cut lunch short by 10 minutes. Just come back 10 minutes earlier than it says in the schedule, which I forget what time it says we're supposed to be done, but just come back 10 minutes earlier, we'll start. We have plenty of time. The food should be out there. We'll see you out there.